Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Product Diaries. This time, we are talking about saving lives with better preventative healthcare. My name is Lucas Latour. I am the host, and in my day job, I'm product evangelist at AWH, where we make custom software products for people. We've been in business for 25 years, located in Dublin, Ohio. So if you ever have any questions around product or software, ever just want to talk shop, feel free to hit me up. Today, our guest is Sara Sable-Antry, who is the founder and CEO of HCRpath. Sara, welcome.
Thank you, Lucas. It's nice to see you today. How are you?
I'm doing well. And how are things on your end?
Pretty well. A little bit busy, as you can imagine, but we're getting ready to start our pilot in 2 weeks. So anyone who's ever had a startup knows that those are some pretty magic words, and I'm really excited. We're in a good place right now.
Well, awesome. It's good to hear. So maybe just to start out, why don't you just tell us a little overview of what HCRpath does?
Not to oversell it, but it's going to save the world. Lucas, no.
Hey, nice. No, I
So
love that.
thank you. I'm a big believer in really trying to make healthcare personal. There's a million reasons why for me and my own life and what I see. We have a guest today that joined us internationally that I've worked with over the years in my hearing industry, but it doesn't matter where you are, if you're in Worthington, Ohio, if you're in Guelph, Ontario, if you're in Switzerland, wherever you are, healthcare should be personal. And I think we've really, in the pursuit of data, we've sort of removed the most important part of that, which is the patient. And so essentially what HCRpath is short-term. It is utilizing Medicare approved surveys that focus on preventative care, wellness for all Medicare subscribers. We all have it as part of our insurance. My 12-year-old, my 14-year-old, they have annual physicals. But the process is pretty antiquated. You might fill it out on paper and pen, someone reviews it, and then next year you come back and wash and repeat, wash and repeat. And so what HCRpath does is really take a step back and say, that's important. That information, that how you feel today, how you felt a few weeks ago is really important that we understand that. And so it's really the foundation of ongoing future patient care that the patient owns. And I think that's really the most important part. All of us have experienced an issue where you have a health record at someone's office and you have to go sign a release form for your health information. Or you have a physician who's maybe here in the Columbus market with Ohio Health, but you had a surgery at Ohio State. So you have to go through a lot of hoops to get those different entities to connect to talk about you, the patient. And so really HCRpath allows the patient to be in charge of their healthcare. And that's kind of the short term, and then long term, there's a lot of other places that can go.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So, there's every startup has a journey. And I guess my first question is, what was really like the initial problem that you noticed or wanted to solve?
The initial problem I wanted to solve started with my 25-year history in the hearing healthcare space.
Hmm.
And a lot of people will think, that's interesting. But for those of us who work with patients who have untreated hearing loss, it's very obvious. You see all these things that the patients experience. Today, of course, they're called comorbidities, but they always weren't. It was, well, my spouse doesn't listen to me, or they're not paying attention. Nope, we're pretty darn aware now that we have cognitive issues with untreated hearing loss. We have cardiovascular issues. We have a huge load for dementia, diabetes. Everything is centered around the ear. And when I first started understanding that in the hearing care space, my eyes really opened up to, what if we use the ears as a way to treat the patient as a whole? And we took a step back, and instead of just asking about the ears, we asked all these other questions that help paint the picture of where that patient stands in their current healthcare system. And it's great to have that data, but then of course, the big problem we had to solve is, how do we get that data from them? And then what do we do with it? And that's really where my work with AWH here in Dublin has come in, where we've built a really great system that connects all those different points. data integrity, as we all know in software, is one of the biggest issues. So we've spent a lot of time understanding that flow of information, understanding how can we make sure that it's obviously safe, that it's PHI compliant, but it needs to be usable and then functional. There's no point to just collect more data. So it's very actionable. And that's really where the Medicare system and the rest of healthcare is going. Great, you identify my problem. Now what do I do about it?
Yeah. So, you noticed this problem. What would you say was sort of like the first way you approached trying to solve it?
Poorly. So it actually started back in 2015. I worked for a Fortune 10 company in the hearing space, and I was doing seminars all over the country relating tinnitus to hearing loss and diabetes to hearing loss, all these comorbidities that we just talked about. And then I started realizing, boy, there's more here. And the FDA was starting to look at how do you make hearing healthcare more ubiquitous? How do you make it more accessible? So I came up with this idea of how to make selective input create your objective output, and specifically around the healthcare model. So, today we call it AI and everything else, but 6 years ago, it was someday there's going to be someone standing in front of an end cap at Walgreens, and they're going to answer a couple questions, and then it's going to say, go pick up your product. I think there's good in that, but I also don't think 17-year-old kids at Best Buy should be dictating hearing healthcare. So it's taking all that information I knew, and I built a platform, a software, and then we patented it. So the IP was initially based on how do we create that intersection of patients and consumers within the hearing healthcare space. So that was the initial approach. And then, of course, as I'm sure we'll talk about, different pivots and everything else brought it to, again, that larger healthcare spec.
Yeah. So what was like sort of the initial like version of the platform? How, I guess, what did it sort of look like?
Of course, I kept that. I drew it out on a flip chart.
Nice.
Yeah, very subjective, right? So some radio buttons with if you answer this type of question. Hearing is based on a lot of different things. We have decibels, we have hertz, we have all these different things, and then we have a lot of speech and noise, the way you judge voices. So just like if you were trying to assess, on a like the VAS scale, on a scale of 1 to 5, how bad is your pain? You can do that with hearing healthcare. So it was really creating this subjective web-based questionnaire. And then of course, on the back end, it was putting all these different things together to put this output. But honestly, I didn't do anything with it, Lucas. I just kind of, at that time, I was actually working for a startup in LA. I was traveling the world, literally. I was in, Switzerland, Denmark all the time, contract manufacturers. And I was really fortunate to work with, some of the best companies in the hearing space. And it was interesting to go from a startup to really mature companies and see the start and stop, the start and stop. And what I realized going into this was having a startup, sometimes it's not about the speed, quality over quantity, things like that. And I took a very slow approach to this because when I looked at that first version, I thought the concept makes sense, but the usability, the functionality, those are all things I can't do, right? So then how do you find your partners? How do you make enough decisions where you go, slow down, don't rush? And I've completely self-funded. I did not want to be swayed by anybody else having equity. So it's been a 3-year process from start. When I, well, actually 6, because in 15 I came up with it. 18, it got granted out of the blue. So from 18 until now, it's been a software development, and now we're going live.
Gotcha. So yeah, you mentioned some of the early versions and kind of the approach, like how it looked and felt and stuff. Did you sort of have like a vision in your head of like what it would be and what it would look like that was sort of different? It's almost like sounded like you started with a very like basic product. What were your sort of like expectations around like the initial version?
So in 2015, even in 2018, it wasn't common to go into a physician's office and have someone hand you a tablet. It was still very much paper pen. So I would say those, the 15 IP, when we filed it, it was literally like a handwritten, screenshots, and it was a tablet-based or kiosk-based interaction with a consumer at the time. So I envisioned you could have it in a physician's office, and while you were waiting for the physician, you would fill out this questionnaire. The physician would review it with you and say, oh, by the way, we actually stock these. If you're interested, get one on the way out. So very much a tablet, touchscreen interface, which in 18 was pretty unique.
Yeah.
Not so much anymore, right?
Gotcha. So, yeah, like tell me a little bit about sort of the product evolution. Like how did it evolve from that original problem?
Good question. I think all startups go through this, where you start out, you're having these conversations, you're focused in a certain area, you're researching these topics. And at that time, I was thinking, okay, these comorbidities are obviously very important, but are they important enough for a physician to go, okay, that's worth my attention? And this is where we get into preventative healthcare. Our physicians are slammed dealing with high risk, high cost all day long. They don't have time to sit down and talk for longer than 6.5 minutes per patient. They can't begin to start thinking about, wow, you're looking really good today. And if you keep that up, you could have a great lifestyle. Let's talk about how you can continue to be healthy. So it's very naive to think that all of a sudden we're going to walk away from a triage healthcare system, which quite frankly is what drives reimbursement. It's how our insurance companies make their money. It's how hospitals and Medicare and everybody does their revenue forecast. It's how many patients can we see per day? How sick are they? What can we bill? And how do we get paid? So I literally am looking at it from 180 degrees different, right? So trying to figure out who was our user, who was our customer, and could we motivate that customer enough? So the original problem of talking to a primary care physician and saying, well, did you know that if you talk about untreated hearing loss, I remember just sitting there one day and I thought, oh my gosh, why are we talking about untreated hearing loss? Why aren't we talking about all of the patient? Why aren't we talking about all these different things? And back to 2015, when I was doing national, discussions on comorbidities, that was the link. And so it really evolved beyond hearing healthcare, which is still near and dear to my heart. But I really started to look at that patient. My dad has hearing loss, right? My dad's a coal miner from West Virginia. We were born in Ohio, born in West Virginia, raised in Ohio. That entire demographic, it's noise-induced hearing loss. It's, if you're either a coal miner or you're a steel mill worker, or it's very blue collar, which I'm super thankful because that's where my work ethic comes from. But these people who live in this type of lifestyle, I saw it all my life. They had terrible arthritis. Their fingers were a mess. Everybody had diabetes. Everybody drank, quite frankly. There's just, this lifestyle is not conducive to being healthy. And then as life progresses, those things catch up. Diabetes, cancer has a huge significance down the road. Dementia, it's all these different things that if we would just, again, take a pause and go, that's not healthy. How do we mitigate it? And how do we get you on the right path? And there are pockets of society that are all about that. And there are pockets of physicians that are all about that. But finding them, that's where it's been interesting and trying to figure out that kind of path forward.
So how would you say sort of the product itself pivoted to sort of accommodate the new direction?
Yeah, so that's a lot of words for me to say, gee, my software we just created doesn't address that.
Right.
Yeah, right. So I was at Rev1 and as an engaged customer of Rev1, and we were doing this customer product pitch. And I did the product pitch, and then the questions that came back, and I just was like, hey, I'll go first. I just want to do a dry run. The questions that came back elucidated all those things I just said. But why wouldn't you think about bigger, better? And so literally the next time we presented it, about 7 days later, it was a completely different go. At that point, AWH was just starting to come in. So the pivot immediately went to a much bigger spectrum. And when you're a startup and you're saying, okay, I'm going to focus on this niche, well, your budget is this niche. And then all of a sudden we went, no, but I want all the patients, right?
Right.
And that required a different budget and a different approach. And honestly, software is not my thing. I've never been involved in software. I don't speak software. So it was really intimidating. One of the first pivots I made was, who's going to build my software? Being in Columbus, Ohio, and having worked globally, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go to New York, I'm going to go to San Francisco, I'm going to, go to some of these different areas that specialize in healthcare software. And fortunately, Ryan Frederick, I got to meet with him, and we went and had lunch. And I thought, okay, you're super cool. I can hang out with you. Let me give you some money. And it's turned into a really great relationship. Chris Slee, who's our CTO, has really helped navigate those pivots, where pivot to me isn't a challenge anymore. It's kind of exciting because it means you're getting closer and closer to what that final product is supposed to look like. So I welcome pivots.
No, that's a great little nugget and something for people to think about too, because I think there's some dissonance sometimes around pivoting when it's your idea or your baby, but what you just said is spot on. It really is putting you in the right direction to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So along those lines, while you're doing pivots and you're kind of taking the new direction, I guess what were some of the bigger challenges that you had to overcome?
So probably working full time this entire time and working where I traveled extensively. Not all startups do that, but again, I did not want to take money from anyone that would change what I was trying to accomplish. The motivation when I'm not a software developer, and we spent 2 years developing the software, that was really tough. Even though it was my baby, it didn't feel tangible. That was hard for me to remain focused and just keep putting the attention on it over and over and over again. So probably about, honestly, 2 months ago, when the transition went from development to going live, I just feel so completely re-engaged. I'm a consultant for the hearing industry. I work for a company out of Denmark and doing some things here in the States. So it's interesting to me because I can absolutely see how all these things continue to dovetail. So now my biggest challenge is stay true. Don't start looking for all these tangential revenue streams or different ways to leverage. I mentioned we have our pilot coming up the first week of March. Our first customer will be our only customer for at least 90 to 120 days. We've got to do it right. And I look at this as a learning opportunity. If you stay really close during your pilot and you're comfortable saying, my baby's not perfect, it's just such a better long-term strategy. So original challenge was staying motivated. And then the new challenge is staying focused on what the core issues are and getting that done before we do anything else that's out of scope.
Gotcha. So you mentioned this upcoming pilot, and I kind of want to transition a little bit to like the users and that sort of stuff. So who are sort of like the potential users for the product?
Yeah. So it's interesting because the users are the patients themselves. What we've actually designed is, again, it's a PHI compliant software. So at the current age, because we're using Medicare to start with, we send an encrypted email link directly to a patient. It's based on the Medicare ID number. They do verification and validation that it's the correct person. And when they submit that, it collects all the different surveys, and they can sit in the comfort of their own home. They can sit and look at their medical bottles. Medicine bottles. If you have a caregiver, if you have any kind of cognitive issues, your family can help fill it out. Your family can fill it out if you have a medical power of attorney. So the user is the patient themselves. But unless we were to go direct to the patient, which is not the current version, well, then who becomes the customer? And so I think that's, kind of that traditional line of how do you work backwards from that. We're speaking with a gentleman who has a large audience overseas, and it would definitely be a direct-to-consumer model. And I would love to do that. One, to start collecting the data, but let's test it. Let's see what happens. We're really seeing that blend of consumer and patient as a hybrid. And I think that that really allows us to open up our door to all users, quite frankly.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a little bit on this before already while we were talking, but for the user, the patient, what exact like needs do they have when they're coming to the platform to use it?
So typically the need is the fact that this is a Medicare provided annual exam. And so, up through 2017, only about 10% of physicians were using this, which tells you how low the utilization is. Unfortunately, in people of color and low socioeconomic, we actually see only a 5% utilization. We also tend to see higher risk, higher cost chronic care systems there as well. So huge mismatch, right? Why is someone not prioritizing this? So if a patient comes to the platform, they have been pushed to the platform by someone who is directly involved in their primary care. That could be a nurse practitioner, that could be their primary care physician. Ideally, it would end up being their insurance carrier or AARP or someone like that. But for them to come to us, they have been told, you need to go fill out this form.
So in terms of like how they use it, they essentially just take your form and they fill it out, right?
That's it. And it's all online. So we do have tablets. So you could actually be, a nurse practitioner could be sitting with someone one-on-one in senior living and fill it out with them or for them. We did a lot of UAT testing, and what we found is we need to be hardware agnostic
Hmm.
and make this software so simple to use that it's, of course, touchscreen or tab through PC, whatever. But you can literally sit and drink a cup of coffee and,
As
have
I
something
am.
on in the background. That's exactly right. And just fill it out. And so, as I'm looking at my parents are starting to age, and I don't have all their healthcare information. I don't know every single surgery. I don't know a lot of the family history. So it's actually a good dialogue to have with your family members, and you literally can just fill it out.
Hmm.
The software itself is intuitive. So if you indicate, do you have any issues with anxiety or depression? You indicate yes. It then is smart enough. It'll bring in another Medicare approved survey that then helps you identify, where are you? Do you need help? Or is this something we need to track? Hearing loss, it uses something called CEDRA out of Northwestern University. Do you need referred on for hearing health? So it's got all these little sub surveys that you really, really get a great aspect of that patient. You really understand the whole view. And then next year, when they fill it out again, it's, do you need to change? Do you need to update? So one time it's like, comprehensive, probably 20-minute survey. And then there on out, it's just adding and updating.
Gotcha. So like in terms of the different user paths, I mean, I guess like how many would you say there are? Is it really just the one?
As far as being a patient. So, as far as, again, a user being a patient, how you get to that patient, that's our customer.
Hmm.
So is it senior living? What we're finding is within senior living, many residents that go to senior living lose access to their primary care physician.
Hmm.
Many senior living facilities might have a medical director on staff, but they're only there once a month. They're only there for certain reasons. But they do have nursing staff that either
Hmm.
is on site or visits. And so we're really excited about the understanding
Hmm.
that nurse practitioners that visit senior livings, this is a really, really good opportunity. Nurse practitioners have this, very great way of looking at patients from start to finish. It's not, oh, I saw that you fall, Myrtle. Let's talk about that. It's okay, why did you fall? Let's talk about your balance. It's really getting a bigger, better understanding. So we're finding partnerships with bringing this platform to our senior housing is number one. The second, of course, is through the primary care physicians themselves. They are motivated by Medicare. The more you complete of these, the higher their reimbursement rate is from Medicare. So there's a very big financial incentive for physicians. However, our software is an add-on. It's a third-party software. So the big systems like Ohio Health, COPC, they have their own EHR systems. We're not going to get into that. But the rural systems that don't have a full IT program, et cetera, we actually did some really good research before we launched, and we did qualitative, quantitative all across the country. And we found that 79% of primary care physicians want more information from their AWVs and IPPEs, which are the wellness visits. 96% of them wanted to actually have some type of customized program that did it for them so they could spend time focusing on the results and the plan, not the administration of it. So this really kind of brings it in. So primary care, senior living right now are two primary paths forward.
Gotcha. So in terms of the platform and sort of the unique kind of selling point or unique value proposition for it, what would you say that is?
Couple things. Number one is how it's being delivered to the patient directly.
Hmm.
As a medical patient here in Central Ohio, I have options through my healthcare providers where I can fill out something like this, but it's not being proactively sent to them. It's also not being collected the way we collect it. It's also not putting together all the back end. So I liked Olive. I was listening to their product tank the other day, and he was saying it's AI as a service. That's what most softwares are anymore, because we all have all this, predictive element built into it. So the systems that are out there are just digitized surveys. Ours are far more than that based on how they interact, the underneath of it. And I think the biggest part that's really unique is, again, it's designed for the patient to complete at home. It's a very, very different way of doing things, and that's what makes healthcare personal.
So in terms of like the current functionalities of it, what are the current functionalities of HCRpath?
So the full survey is good to go. We can, send it to a patient. They do the validation with the Medicare ID number. It recognizes whether you're male, female, so that way we're asking appropriate questions. It recognizes if it's already been billed to Medicare and if you're eligible for this service. The full survey is there. It also provides output with meaningful action. What we're working on now is the administrative part of that to set up a new practice. And quite frankly, we want to do that with our partners. We want to work with our pilot locations to say, it's your business and you know how you want to do things. Help us understand what that front end and back end part should look like, so that the data that we collect is able to be exported, or from an API perspective, imported into your current EHR systems. So the meat is there. It's really exciting to see how it works. It's just now we're waiting on in a couple more weeks or so, we'll have that kind of, how do we wrap up that functionality? But it's ready to go live. It's ready to be commercialized.
That's awesome. So, what would you say is your vision for the future?
Everyone owns their own healthcare, and it's through this. You log in, that's you, and you grant access to healthcare entities. You grant access to physicians. It's the other way around right now, right? It's you have to ask someone to give you access to your records, and I think it's atrocious at the end of the day. So yeah, long term, we all own our own healthcare diary, and HCRpath is the start of that.
Awesome. Well, I just have one more question, which is sort of, as you know, the product has evolved. How has the product evolution like driven sort of the business evolution?
I think when you do a startup, you can, I wouldn't use the word lonely, although there's a lot that people talk about that. But when you have something that you see so clearly in your head, and you don't necessarily have that sounding board, you can kind of get into your own head too, right? Where you're like, oh, this is kind of a dumb idea, or this really doesn't have anything. Then when you start expanding it, which is really where the business is starting to evolve, is bringing in appropriate people who can help drive it further. So having Chris Lee as our CTO, he has an amazing background in healthcare software in the Columbus market. That'll make me better. I recently hired a fractional chief revenue officer, Ed Porter. I mean, he's so great at what he does. And when I met Ed, I said, your job is to kick me in my butt. Your job is to push me. People who know me, I'm extremely driven. I'm annoyingly so. I may have been called aggressive.
No, that's
But
good.
when it comes to your startup, it can be really hard. So now it's putting it to the next step, that as we commercialize, it's surrounding myself with people who can do far greater things than I can, pushing me, but also pushing the business forward.
Wow. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that and sharing sort of your product diary and the journey thus far. I think it's super interesting, and I'm really excited about where HCRpath is going to go and the impact that you're going to make. So I will just wrap up by saying, once again, this has been Product Diaries with AWH. If anybody wants to contact us, it's awh.net/contact or #contact, depending on how hip you are. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming to Product Diaries, and we will see you at the next one.